Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The independent watchdog that regulates political finance in the UK has launched a formal investigation into the funding of renovations to Boris Johnson's Downing Street flat. The Electoral Commission said there were reasonable grounds to suspect an offence or offences may have occurred. The row over who first paid for the renovations dominated Prime Minister's questions today. As our political editor Laura Koonsberg explains, it's not against the rules to receive donations, but politicians must declare them so the public can see where the money has come from.
There's no place like home.
Are you worried about the investigation, Prime Minister?
And there's been no fix quite like this for Boris Johnson before.
Who coughed up for the flat, sir?
His flats had an expensive makeover. He won't say who first paid. A mystery that's now subject to a serious investigation. But the Electoral Commission today said, we are now satisfied there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence or offences may have occurred. With claims that Tory donors might have picked up the tab, the suspicion the rules were broken.
Initially is the key word here. Who initially paid for the redecoration of his Downing Street flat?
He should know that I paid for Downing Street refurbishment personally, Mr. Speaker. Any further declaration that I have to make, I will, if any, I will be advised upon by Lord Geit.
Lord Geit used to work for the Queen, and he'll now watch over ministers' behaviour. But remember, the question isn't who stumped up in the end. It's who paid Boris Johnson's bills at the start.
What do we get from this Prime Minister and this Conservative government? Dodgy contracts, jobs for their mates and cash for access. And who's at the heart of it? The Prime Minister, Major Sleaze, sitting there. Don't the British people deserve a Prime Minister they can trust and a government that isn't mired in sleaze, cronyism and scandal?
Week after week, the people of this country can see the difference between a Labour Party that twists and turns with the wind, that thinks of nothing except playing political games, whereas this party gets on with delivering on the people's priorities.
This isn't about spending cash on cushions or curtains. It's about where the money came from to do so at the start. All politicians have to declare any money or loans they receive so that we can all be absolutely sure precisely what's going on. But the Prime Minister appears to be feeling the heat now on several fronts. Angry denials down there were the order of the day.
Did the Prime Minister rage he'd rather see bodies pile up than lock down again? As several sources familiar with the exchanges have told the BBC and other news organisations.
Can the Prime Minister tell the House categorically, yes or no, did he make those remarks or remarks to that effect?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, and I think that if he's going to repeat allegations like that, he should come to this House and substantiate those allegations.
Parliamentary rules stop me from saying that the Prime Minister has repeatedly lied to the public over the last week. But can I ask the question? Are you a liar, Prime Minister?
I didn't say those words. What I do believe is that a lockdown is a miserable, miserable thing. And I did everything I could to try to protect the British public throughout the pandemic, to protect them from lockdowns, but also to protect them from disease.
Yet the Prime Minister's opponents are trying to peck away at Boris Johnson's integrity. And at the very least, unanswered questions are a big distraction.
If a serving government minister is found to have broken the rules on party funding or even law, should they resign?
Given that this is a coronavirus press conference, you won't be surprised that I'm not going to add to the answers the Prime Minister's already given to very extensive questioning. Thanks.
But avoiding questions doesn't make them disappear. There are multiple inquiries now into exactly what happened. Political reputations must be tended to with care.
And you could tell there the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, didn't really want to touch any of this with a barge pole. And I think it's probably safe to assume that he's not the only government minister that would feel that way. You know, the connections between money and politics can get pretty toxic. Remember, all of this matters because there are strict rules about how politicians are meant to be completely open and completely transparent about any money they receive from anyone, loans, gifts or any kind of thing. And we know, George, tonight now, there are enough question marks for an independent organisation, the Electoral Commission, to think that it is worth their while starting a formal investigation. It's not about whether or not the Prime Minister and his fiancée chose Persian rugs or velvet cushions. It's about that very important principle. Remember too, though, the Prime Minister was firm today. As far as he's concerned, no rules have been broken.
Laura, thank you very much.
The political spending watchdog is launching an investigation into how the Prime Minister's refurbishment of his Downing Street flat was funded, saying there were reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence may have taken place. Boris Johnson has insisted that he covered the costs himself, but still hasn't confirmed whether anyone else initially paid the bill. And a reminder from Number 10, the Prime Minister still has the power to exonerate himself of any possible breach of the ministerial code. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
Which he voted for.
The Prime Minister speaking just after he'd heard on the news that he was being investigated for possible offences over secret donations. His spokesperson said she didn't think it had annoyed him.
Which he opposed.
The Electoral Commission is investigating who originally paid for the redecoration of the Prime Minister's apartments last year and why wasn't such a gift declared. Boris Johnson insists he has now, maybe as recently as last week, settled the bill himself, but it's suspected others secretly paid that bill months ago.
Who paid the initial invoice, Prime Minister, for the redecoration of the Prime Minister's flat, the initial invoice?
I have covered the costs, and I think most people will find it absolutely bizarre. And of course there's an Electoral Commission investigating this, and I can tell him that I've conformed in full with the Code of Conduct, with ministerial code, and officials have been advising me throughout this whole thing.
At the heart of the allegations, an email revealed by the Daily Mail from David Brownlow, a Tory donor and Tory peer. In October last year, Lord Brownlow emailed 3 Tory officials. Further to our conversation, I'm making a donation to the party today. £58,000 to cover the payments the party has already made on behalf of the soon-to-be-formed Downing Street Trust.
It's been widely reported that Lord Brownlow, who just happens to have been given a peerage by the Conservative Party, was asked to donate £58,000 to help repay for the cost of this refurbishment. Can the Prime Minister, if he's so keen to answer, confirm, did Lord Brownlow make that payment for that purpose?
The answer is that I have covered the costs. I have met the requirements that I've been obliged to meet in full.
Number 10 announced that Lord Geidt, for 10 years Private Secretary to the Queen, will be the Prime Minister's new advisor on ministerial standards. But the chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, Lord Evans, wrote to the Prime Minister this afternoon to register his concern that the advisor will still lack the authority to initiate investigations, which raised questions, he said, about independence and transparency. With uncomfortable timing, Boris Johnson's next-door neighbour, Rishi Sunak, who lives with his family in the other Downing Street flat, today announced that he'd redecorated his apartment last year and paid the whole bill himself up front. And that's exactly what the Prime Minister's former aide Dominic Cummings says he told the Prime Minister to do months ago. As you listen to the Prime Minister in the Commons today, you could think you were listening to the outline of the defence he'll give if, as some think, he's told he should have declared who was paying for the decoration of the flat much earlier. The rules weren't entirely clear. The party thought it was doing the right thing. Officials were kept fully informed. If the Electoral Commission decides the rules have been breached, it could fine the Tory party up to £20,000. If it thinks that was intentional, it could report them to the police. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
In anyone's book, £58,000 is a heck of a lot of money, and it could end up costing the Prime Minister dear. Parliament's spending watchdog, the Electoral Commission, today launched an investigation into where the money to pay for the now infamous Downing Street flat upgrade originally came from. There were, it said, grounds to suspect an offence may have occurred. In a hot-tempered Prime Minister's questions, Mr Johnson insisted he'd not broken any laws. 3 times he said he'd paid for the work personally. He would not say who settled the initial bill. In the meantime, he had appointed the Queen's former private secretary, Lord Geidt, as his new independent adviser on standards, a man generally admired for his integrity and certainly no pushover, which could make it an interesting appointment and possibly one Downing Street comes to regret. In a moment, Robert will give us his understanding of the money trail. First, Romilly on Mr Johnson counting the cost of curtains.
A week into this crisis and the Prime Minister is under siege from all angles. Allegations about lobbying, what he might have said about lockdowns, and most problematically now, who paid for his number 11 flat to be done up. Today, the Electoral Commission announced a formal investigation into the funding of the renovations, saying they're satisfied that there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence or offences may have occurred. It led to explosive exchanges at Prime Minister's questions.
That's incredibly serious. Can the Prime Minister tell the House, does he believe that any rules or laws have been broken?
Prime Minister.
No, I don't, Mr Speaker. And he goes on, Mr Speaker, about wallpaper when, as I've told him umpteen times now, I paid for it.
I asked the Prime Minister again, who paid the initial invoice?
Mr Speaker, I've given him the answer, and the answer is I have covered the costs, and I think most people will find it absolutely bizarre. And of course there's an Electoral Commission investigating this, and I can tell him that I've conformed in full with the Code of Conduct.
The Prime Minister didn't give every appearance of someone enjoying the line of questioning.
And above all, taking back control of our country has allowed us to deliver the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, as he well knows, Mr Speaker.
There is an annual allowance of £30,000 to do up the Prime Minister's flat above Downing Street here. We know that Boris Johnson's home decor went above that, and he has now paid the excess himself. What is still strangely murky is whether a Tory donor or even the Tory party paid initially. And there are now 3 separate investigations into an issue you would have thought the Prime Minister could clear up himself. This is what the number 11 flat looked like under David Cameron, who spent much less on it. But decor like this by interior designer Lulu Little, favoured by the Prime Minister's fiancée, clearly does not come cheap. Now it will also be the task of the newly appointed adviser on ministerial standards, Lord Geidt, former private secretary to the Queen, to look into who paid what when. This former Standards chair believes the Prime Minister's actions warrant scrutiny.
He hasn't got a very good track record of keeping to rules. He clearly is irritated by them. Most of us, if we're going to carry out a refurbishment in our property, we check we've got the money first.
And that's not the only problem brewing. The Labour leader also wanted to know whether the Prime Minister had said that he'd rather let bodies pile high than order another lockdown.
No, Mr Speaker.
Well, somebody here isn't telling the truth. The House will have heard the Prime Minister's answer, and I remind him the Ministerial Code says, and I quote, "Ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation."
Those who claim the Prime Minister did say such a thing suggest they're prepared to give evidence on oath. None of these issues are going away for Mr Johnson, no matter how much he might wish it. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
Well, this is, of course, a good moment to go and consult Robert, who's, as you can see, preparing to do his show tonight, which always worth watching, will be doubly worth watching tonight. Now, Robert, 2 very clear on-the-record denials today. Where do you think this goes?
So, I've got Keir Starmer interviewing on the show tonight. He's repeated what you've already heard him say, that if the Prime Minister misled Parliament when he said today that he didn't make those extraordinary remarks that 2 witnesses told me the Prime Minister did say about, you know, he'd rather see bodies piling up by the 1,000 than have a third lockdown. If he did say that, Keir Starmer says that's a breach of the ministerial code. He expects the Prime Minister, he would expect the Prime Minister to resign. Now, who knows whether ultimately that issue will be proved one way or another. But then there are these investigations into how the flat, the apartment redecoration was being paid for. You've got the Electoral Commission, an investigation into a possible breach of the law if they find against the Tory party. That is very, very embarrassing for the Prime Minister. We do know, I've talked to you about this before, that he borrowed money from the Tory party. Nothing has yet been disclosed on it. If that failure to disclose is a breach of electoral law. That is one problem. If there are also two separate investigations going on to whether he breached the ministerial code by failing to make declarations about how he financed the flat. So a lot could go wrong for the Prime Minister. I would say, though, there are two caveats when it comes to assessing how damaging this will be. One is, guests on my show say that as yet they are not seeing this resonating with voters. If his popularity, if the Tory party's popularity doesn't fall, he will be that much stronger. But secondly, and this is sort of extraordinary, in the terms of reference for the main inquiry today, the Prime Minister said ultimately he would be marking the homework. He would decide whether he's breached the ministerial code. And what do you think? Do you think the Prime Minister is going to say, I put my hands up, I got it all wrong? Don't think that's going to happen, do you?
We will see. Somehow no, but Robert, thank you very much. To be continued ad nauseam, I suspect, that subject, but for now, thank you very much.
The Electoral Commission says there are reasonable grounds to suspect an offence may have occurred as it launches a full investigation into the Conservative Party over payment of the Downing Street furnishings. Tonight, why do we still not know the sequence and timing of a payment that's causing the PM such a headache? Wouldn't it be simpler to tell the public what went on? This is not a story about furnishings, wallpaper and mood lighting. It's not even a story about John Lewis. It's a story about which money changed hands to pay for them, why it's not yet been formally declared, and why we still don't know what happened. Today, the Electoral Commission launched a full investigation into the question, saying they had reasonable grounds to consider an offence may have occurred. And it comes in the middle of a week when the Prime Minister had to face inquisitions on other matters of conduct. Today, he was forced to flatly deny in the House of Commons a quote widely attributed to him about COVID deaths. If today's denials prove to be untrue, he could be forced to resign for misleading Parliament. Why does all this matter? Well, you know the script, that this is an internal row between a boss and his former adviser, that any donations have now been repaid, that fittings and fixtures are the least of Britain's problems right now. Well, it matters because it involves standards, rules and integrity in public office. And once those values start to erode, can the public ever expect to get them back? Our first report tonight is by Lewis Goodall.
Fancy wallpaper, fittings and fixtures aren't often the matters which land ministers, let alone prime ministers, in trouble. But then, this imbroglio isn't really about wallpaper or furniture or designers. It's about pivotal democratic questions, about transparency, about law, whether someone might have a financial hold on the Prime Minister, and about knowing whether they might, about potential corruption or even the perception of corruption. And it is the Electoral Commission which is in charge of investigating whether any rules, any laws have been broken in regards to the Downing Street flat refurbishment. This morning they confirmed they will be investigating, saying, "We are now satisfied that there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence or offences may have occurred. We will therefore continue this work as a formal investigation to establish whether this is the case."
Are you worried about the investigation, Prime Minister?
That statement came less than an hour before Prime Minister's questions.
Who initially paid for the redecoration of his Downing Street flat?
Boris Johnson refused to answer whether he made the initial payment for his flat refurbishment or whether someone else did, clinging resolutely to one form of words.
As for the latest stuff that he's bringing up, he should know that I paid for Downing Street refurbishment personally. Mr. Speaker, I've given him the answer, and the answer is I have covered the costs, and I think I've answered this question several times now. And the answer is that I have covered the costs.
The central question is whether a donation or loan was given for the refurbishment, whether that was a proper use of party money, and whether it was declared properly.
The responsibility lies on the recipient of the donation or the loan. So it can be either a party or an individual.
Why is it the case that it really does matter?
It's not about wallpaper, it's about transparency and openness. And so the public's entitled to know who's paying whom in politics. This is not a trivial matter or just a convention or just a social matter. These are legal rules, and disobeying them by people in positions of great power and importance is a serious matter, whatever they are.
So where might the money have come from? It's been reported in the Daily Mail that Lord Brownlow is the man who provided the initial donation to the Conservative Party and had later been lined up to be chairman of the Downing Street Trust, which never got off the ground. He's a Tory donor of long standing. He was appointed to the Lords by Theresa May and an investor in Samantha Cameron's fashion business. But in terms of those under scrutiny, it won't just be the Prime Minister. Principal in the Commission's line of sight would be Tory co-chairman Amanda Milling and Ben Elliott. And even if the Electoral Commission decides that no wrongdoing has been committed, the stonewalling is itself a problem. The Ministerial Code does make it clear that ministers must ensure that not only is there no conflict of interest, but there is no perception of a conflict of interest.
I think that's the really important thing to bear in mind here. Even if, at the end of the day, the Electoral Commission finds that no law has been broken, no rule has been broken, if it were the case that a donor gave money to the Conservative Party, which it subsequently loaned to Boris Johnson, that didn't break any law to do that, but he was aware of who had given that money that he was then being able to make use of, surely that is still a conflict of interest and might be perceived as such, and that really is the damaging thing.
And then there was this, when the Prime Minister was asked on the record whether he did make the comment about bodies piling up. He said this.
No, Mr. Speaker.
But note Starmer's satisfaction at the end.
I'll leave it there for now. Turning to another issue. There'll be further on this. There'll be further on this, believe you me.
Perhaps it was just a down payment on a potential political future. Starmer making sure that he has what he needs lest a recording should emerge or something else should happen in the meantime. But there did seem something rather deliberate in how Starmer spoke and certainly in how he reacted. A reaction which may have caused a little bit of disquiet, a little bit of nervousness inside Number 10. But either way, today seemed like a day of which we don't have many. A day when the laws of political gravity, which Boris Johnson so often defies, if not quite caught up with him, then certainly began to exert an almighty gravitational pull. As he sits in the Downing Street flat tonight, Boris Johnson can admire his new decor. He and we are now only too aware of its price. He may be about to discover its cost.
That was Lewis Goodall, and Lewis is here now. We've got new information on this tonight, Lewis. What have you heard?
Yes, indeed, Emily. Tonight we've spoken to Baroness J. She's a Labour peer. There's been a lot of speculation about this idea of a Downing Street Trust. We know from the Cabinet Secretary's appearance earlier in the week before Parliament that Lord Brownlow, who I mentioned in my report there, who is alleged to be the donor that is behind so much of this trouble, was going to be the head of that putative trust. And we've spoken to Baroness Jason, as I say, Labour peer, daughter of former Labour Prime Minister Jim Callaghan, who told us that she indeed was approached personally by Lord Brownlow earlier this year to sit on that Downing Street Trust, which of course never got off the ground. This is what she's told us tonight. Earlier this year, I was approached by Lord Brownlow, whom I had never met. He asked if I would like to become a trustee on the Downing Street Trust. Although nothing formal was ever agreed, I did say I would be interested to join on the basis it was similar to the Chequers Trust, of which I used to be a member. The proposed trust would be for the public part of Downing Street, not the residences. I had a conversation with the Labour leader in the Lords, Baroness Smith, when I was first approached, and a subsequent one with the Cabinet Secretary. I think the really interesting thing about that, Emily, there was some reporting yesterday by Sky News saying that Lord Darling, former Chancellor Alistair Darling, had been approached to be on this trust and he turned it down. That said that he was approached by Number 10 officials. This confirmation tonight that Lord Brownlow was approaching, indeed, at least Baroness J, indicating that he was very much central, at least to this idea of the trust. And as I say, although no suggestion I was saying in my report there in making that donation that Lord Brownlow has done anything wrong, he certainly seems to have been a central player in this whole affair.
Interesting stuff, Lewis. Thanks very much indeed. Well, joining us now, Andrew Bridgen for the Conservative Party and Thangam Debonair, Labour's Shadow Housing Secretary. Welcome to you both. Andrew, if I can start with you and the statement in the Commons where the PM made it very clear that he never said the words or phrases about bodies that were attributed to him by many who claim he did. What happens if it is proved that he did?
Well, I think we know what the Prime Minister did by his actions. We've had very strong lockdowns. He's delivered that. We've suppressed the virus. But, Emily, we've got very important local elections next week. The Labour Party can't attack the government's record on delivering Brexit, on the vaccine rollout, which is the best of any developed country in the world. Independent forecasters predicting 8%
Hang on a second, Andrew,
economic
forgive me.
growth
This is
this
about
year.
the Prime Minister's word, isn't it? This is about the Prime Minister's word. He was asked very clearly, just a second, he was asked very clearly by the opposition leader if he denied saying those words. And he denied firmly saying those words and anything around it.
Very clear at the dispatch box. But what this is about, Emily, is Labour can't attack the government's record. They can't play the ball. Important elections, they're just playing the man.
OK, so
and you're going along with it.
OK, if he did say those words, if it is proven in later time that he did say those words, would he need to resign for misleading the House?
If he's breached the code of conduct, the ministerial code, then there would be a sanction, and that could be resignation.
OK.
It isn't always, but it could be. But I mean, the Prime Minister was very clear, and he's denied the other allegations that have been laid at his door as well, very clearly.
He has indeed. And the Electoral Commission tonight, we know, is investigating that initial payment for the refurbishments. They say there is reasonable grounds to suspect there is an offence. Now, we'll remember not so long ago that the Tories tried to scrap the Electoral Commission. So will you accept any outcome that they do find?
Well, we'll have to see what their outcome is. IPSA and Parliamentary Standards are investigating the Labour mayoral candidate for the West Midlands for diverting, potentially, allegedly, parliamentary funds into their campaign account. But we're not talking about that tonight, are we?
No, we're not. We're talking about the Electoral Commission investigating this payment.
A Labour-controlled council in Liverpool that was so corrupt that it's now under direct government control. We're not talking about that.
You're absolutely right.
If Labour want to go on sleeves, they're on a kamikaze mission, quite honestly, Emily. Their track record is appalling.
OK, well, let's stick with this because it does involve the Prime Minister right at the centre. And you'll know tonight that Lord Guy's been brought in to investigate that payment. So if it is found by him that Boris Johnson broke the ministerial code, should he resign?
Well, that depends on the degree with which he's broken and what he's actually broken. We're talking about the Prime Minister spending his own money, doing a flat, which he'll be the incumbent for a period of time. He will not be taking the benefit with him. It's not costing the taxpayer anything. What's really important on the doorstep for the matters we're not talking about, which is the vaccine rollout, the economic growth, the jobs and prosperity that this government's delivering in advance of these local elections next week. That's what people are interested in on the doorsteps. This is a media bubble story which only resonates in central London.
Except I'd put to you that it's not just about electoral prizes that you're getting on the doorstep. This is about the foundations of democracy. It's about decency. It's about accountability. It's about integrity. It's about transparency. It's about not lying when you're asked questions.
Emily, it took me 3 years to get that sleazebag Keith Vaz out of Parliament. He remained a member of the Labour National Executive Committee, and he's still a member of the Labour Party today, despite the fact that he's banned from ever setting foot back in Parliament.
He's not here to defend himself, but let me pick up with Thangam Debonair. You've got the independent advisor for standards on this, Lord Guy. You have the Electoral Commission. Presumably, you now believe in these people to do their jobs.
Well, we welcome the Electoral Commission. And remember, the Electoral Commission has said that they're carrying out this inquiry because they believe, not us, they believe there is sufficient grounds to suspect that a crime may have been committed, or an offence, may have been committed. That's important. But we also welcome the other 8 inquiries and counting who have all decided that there is something to look at here, that there are contracts that were inappropriately awarded or could have been, that there's been cover-up, that there's been favours for mates, that there's not been the selflessness, the accountability, the honesty, the openness, which Mr Bridgen, but more importantly, the Prime Minister signed up to when he became an MP. Those are the Nolan principles of public life. Those 7 principles should be governing everything. They are higher standards than merely what is expected by the law. They are higher than that. They are important to keep to because the British public, after what we've been through this year, after what every member of the British public has been through in terms of loss, in terms of pain and grief, they deserve better. They deserved to have a Prime Minister that actually sticks to those principles of honesty and leadership.
Well, let's not jump ahead because Keir Starmer cited media reports of the quote that Boris Johnson is alleged to have made. Does Keir Starmer know he made those remarks about the bodies? Does he have evidence?
Well, I mean, Keir said that he was going to return to that. He mentioned that in Prime Minister's questions. But I think what we do know here is that the Electoral Commission has decided that there is something to investigate here, and I think
Not
that's
about
important. No, but we started out by talking about what the Electoral Commission is investigating. I don't know what's in Keir's notebook. I just know that the man's a very experienced lawyer. He helped prosecute, actually, many bad people over the years when he was head of the Crown Prosecution Service. I think he probably knows what he's doing there.
Except it all comes back to, not the Electoral Commission, that's a separate thing, but the ministerial code goes back to the Prime Minister. Andrew Bridgen, the Prime Minister can decide himself whether he wants to abide by the ministerial code, whatever its findings.
And that is under the gift of the Prime Minister. But
should it be?
These allegations have come from a former member of staff at Downing Street, Dominic Cummings, a man who, when he gave his reasons for travelling to the north of England, you called him a liar, and yet when he makes allegations,
I didn't call him a liar.
You disbelieved him and called for him to be sacked. Now he has been sacked and he makes his allegations. You believe everything he says because it suits the agenda you've got. I mean, it's the hypocrisy, quite honestly, is rank.
Well, actually, I think it shows consistency that our job is to try and hold those in power to account. So we ask the questions, whatever side they're on, just because they're on different sides.
Story about travelling to the north of England, but you believe word for word everything a disgruntled former employee says about his boss who sacked him.
I'm interested in whether you think it's important that we get to the bottom of this, because there are questions that we just don't know. We don't have the answers to. That's all we're trying to do here.
There's an investigation ongoing and we should let it run its course. But in the meantime, we've got very important elections locally, and these are not issues that are important to my constituents on the doorstep in Colville this afternoon. They're interested in whether they're going to have jobs.
Yeah, thank you, Devon. What do you say to Andrew Bridgen's Colville constituents and the electorate there?
I expect that constituents across the country think that honesty is actually very important and that it is something that they deserve to have in their politicians and especially their Prime Minister. We've got numerous scandals going on here. And if we look at what's happening, for instance, with the Greensill affair, with David Cameron, a former Prime Minister, having written a lobbying act, having whipped his MPs to vote against a register for private lobbyists, for corporate lobbyists to be registered and have to required to sign that register, he is now one of those. He's taken advantage of something that he wrote into law in order to put himself in a very murky position. And the defence here is he hasn't done anything against the rules. So I say again, we should be set by higher standards. And in fact, we are. We all, as politicians, have to sign up to those Nolan sisters, those Nolan principles.
Wanted from the Treasury, he got from the Treasury. The government did not give in to any of his requests.
And if I could just finish, I believe that Mr Bridgen's constituents, just like mine, expect honesty from their politicians, and they certainly deserve it, even if they don't expect it from some.
Mr Bridgen, you did talk about constituents caring about jobs, and it seems extraordinary that last spring this all happened, the pandemic raging around us, our neighbours, Italy showing us what an emergency health crisis looks like. The PM still had the time to set up discussions about a trust fund for his refurbishment. Everyone was thinking about their jobs then and what happens then. Why wasn't he?
Because the Prime Minister has to juggle many things at the same time. He's responsible
trust fund for his refurbishment.
And that will be dealt with by people below him. It wouldn't be dealt with by the Prime Minister himself. He wouldn't be spending his time doing that. He was dealing with the pandemic. And we have rolled out the best vaccine response of any developed nation. No wonder the Labour Party don't want to talk about things like that. They want to talk about this media bubble story that no one on the doorsteps is really interested in.
Thank you very much. Thank you both of you very much.